Welcome to Profit, the journey through recovery. Your recovery process could be post-surgery. You could have sustained an accident. You could have had some trauma to your system. You could be exercising and through very poor movement patterns, you could be wearing and tearing your system down, resulting in tendons, ligaments, and muscular strains on a repetitive basis. You could have a congenital disorder that plays a major role in your recovery and limiting that thereof. Hi everyone, I'm Carey. I'm a correctional exercise specialist at Profit, and as a team at Profit, we are essentially very focused on playing the correct role in our clients' movement patterns, ensuring that as movement practitioners that we are adhering to exactly what needs to be done in order to ensure that our clients are getting to a position where they're fundamentally recovering well. What I'd like to do today is I'd like to just chat about each joint structure. Hopefully some of this information may be relevant to you. If it isn't, maybe you've learned something along the process. But let's dive into the system. Let's take a look at a couple of areas throughout our system, common scenarios that may be an area that you may have had before. Maybe you know a friend that possibly has also sustained these type of injuries before. What is the recovery process? What is the rehabilitative process? What should you know and what questions should you ask? Let's take a look. The rehab process. Now, what does that mean? Where do you fall in with regards to rehab? What type of rehab do I need? What does rehab mean? Does it mean strengthening for me? Does it mean stabilization for me? Does it mean that I need to really start taking a very conservative approach to my rehabilitation? Where are you in relation to your joint dysfunction and pain? Now, all of that needs to be correctly diagnosed. You've got to go through a strict diagnostic process to make sure that the right people have intervened, have assessed the scenario, and are now grouping together, medical professionals are grouping together to make sure that your recovery process has a happy outcome and a very successful one at that. Personal trainers are not certified or qualified to administer rehabilitative movements at all. So as movement practitioners, it's important that we as individuals take the responsibility of your system as and when it's key and when it's necessary, in conjunction with the medical professionals that work with us to make sure that that client is then handed down to the right individuals who can make sure that your entire process leading up to that individual will never be negated. You're never going to be cancelling out the benefit that you've just achieved given all the work that you've done, possibly with a physiotherapist. So those type of things are fundamentally hugely important, and that's an outlook that every single person needs to take, because at the end of the day, rehab, as the word is, needs to be taken very seriously, especially when it comes to specific joints. So again, let's take a look at the joint structures and let's learn a little bit. Our central nervous systems are key. They are a massive system that allows for a network of nerve cells and fibers to send nerves and impulses all the way right down through our system to be able to feed what? Our motor control, our muscular control. They allow our system to adapt to all the demands and stresses placed on our system, including an emotional and physiological perspective. That's very closely related. As you can see via this diagram, that the actual network that I'm talking of is extensive. Every single area feeds off another. It really is like a tree-like formation. Now, that is a complex system. That is not a system to be taken lightly, which is the reason why when we are recovering from a process, our central nervous system is under duress. We need to really start making sure that we manage our systems effectively to ensure that our central nervous system, which includes our breathing, our adaptation to movements, our brain's ability to communicate with what we're doing and gain the right feedback. All of that is key to make sure that our road to recovery is going to be governed well and it's going to be successful. Neck pain. Neck pain could be a condition called spondylosis. Now, spondylosis is a degenerative condition where effectively we get osteophytes that are little bony growths, they form, and we have a narrowing of the disc spaces in the cervical spine and the neck area, and they can encroach on nerve endings, and can, not on all occasions, but can give you some ridiculous pain going down the arm. What does that mean? Well, it means your grip strength is increased. Sometimes we'll have pain at certain areas of the body. It may be anywhere along that neural line of communication, right down to our digits as well. So the type of discomfort that we obtain doesn't necessarily have to be something like spondylosis. It could be simply just really, really poor posture over a period of time. Now, what creates that? Sitting. What we do for a greater part in a given day is sitting at a computer, less activity, less movement, allows for the body to be placed under a large degree of compression. Just to give you a stat, the amount of compressional load on your spine is heightened by 9 times when you sit as opposed to when you stand. So that goes without saying that standing and moving is still the best way to manage our spine going forward. This shape of this spine is known as excessive cervical lordosis, which basically means is that this forward shape of this spine is providing in a very much a forward head lean position. However, that will not be working in isolation. This individual will have some excessive curvature of his mid-back, and in return, an excessive curvature of his lower back. All of those areas need to be addressed in order to make sure that we manage the spine. But take into account the neck pain. This is something that can't be dealt in isolation. We have to look at the entire spinal column in order to make sure that we are remedying the entire system. The spine is pretty much the central point to our system and is the focal point to all our movement patterns, basically feed off the spine. So it's essential that we tend to every single area to make sure that the client is not placed in a position we are promoting pain, where they are given all the tools to understand how to start managing their neck and their posture going forward. The shoulder joint. Welcome to the most complex joint on our system. This is fundamentally a joint that, when injured, the rehabilitative process is very extensive, and it needs to be taken into a huge amount of care simply because of the complexity of the joint. It's the only joint literally where the head of the humerus moves and articulates at ranges and angles that no other joint in our body does. So we can generate all our arm movement where we need to reach in normal daily routines. Now, there's a ton of conditions that could affect your shoulder, and this is important to know. You've got osteoarthritis, which is a degenerative disease where we basically have the cartilage wears down between the bones, and that causes friction. Okay. Now you've also got rheumatoid arthritis, which is really where your immune system basically attacks the lining around the joints, and that can dramatically affect and influence the range of movement, the pain, the swelling, and also the stiffness inside the joint. Now, you could have suffered from a dislocation. That could have occurred out of, a lot of people getting up out of a boat, or they're getting pulled by someone and they get that dislocation. Now, that type of scenario is also, it doesn't seem like a very big thing. Well, the joint wasn't really overly damaged. It should be fine over time. But the process that you administer and the exercises that you do thereafter are key to make sure that that joint doesn't remain unstable. You could have had a fracture to your system. The most common fractures on the shoulder are typically the clavicle and obviously the humerus. So these areas, the arm bone and the collarbone, essentially are the two areas that are most common to be injured and fractured. If that is the case, well, now your process is going to have to be quite slow, because obviously you've got the healing of the bone marrow to take into account, and to make sure that everything is in a workable order before you start administrating some corrective work. You've got an element like bursitis. Now, this type of condition can occur in many joint structures in our body, but a bursa basically is a fluid-filled sac that's basically in between bones as well, to allow for the tendons and ligaments to be able to glide easy. So the rotator cuff. If we have a look at the rotator cuff, now effectively there's 4 muscles of the rotator cuff, and their role is effectively to hold the head of the humerus, this arm bone, and keep it in place inside the joint, inside the shoulder capsule, to keep it stable. That's the primary role of the rotator cuff. So a lot of people think that the rotator cuff is the shoulder. It's only part of the shoulder. The shoulder system is extensive. Beyond the arm, you've got the scapula, which is pretty much the most important area of the shoulder to manage. And then obviously all the adjoining points off that shoulder. And given the movement of the arm, there's a massive amount of areas that needs to be taken into account before you start the rehabilitative process. The tears and ruptures of rotator cuff tendons are quite common. A lot of people will sustain falls, and typical skiing injury, people fall and they can tear the infraspinatus tendon. Now that will require, any full rupture of a tendon will require surgery. But now your movement thereafter is going to be hugely essential. You've got to focus on the correct physiotherapy-based work to make sure that you are not going to incorrectly load that arm, and you're not going to compromise that structure post-surgery. The frozen shoulder scenario. Now, there's 3 stages of a frozen shoulder. What stage of a frozen shoulder do you fall into? Now, that's going to be fundamentally crucial to make sure that if you are in specific stages of a frozen shoulder, you don't want to just simply get a device to be able to move your arm freely in all different directions, like we often will see on social media, when in actual fact, that at that given stage, that given movement may be totally contraindicated to the actual recovery process. So you've got to be very mindful as to, hang on a sec, what do you mean by frozen shoulder? Now, a frozen shoulder really is, it's where adhesions basically form around the joint capsule, and it basically restricts a lot of movement and it starts to lock it down. It's very painful, as is a tendon and rupture tear. So, but to make sure that, do we want movement with a frozen shoulder? Yes, absolutely. We want movement, but we want the right movement, which means you have to have the correct people to administer the correct movement to make sure that those planes of movement that you're using are exactly what your shoulder needs given where it's at that given point, whether it's a frozen shoulder, whether it's just basic impingement. Now, what is impingement? Now, impingement is basically where we run out of space in the shoulder. Okay, so what does that mean? So that the head of this humerus here basically gets pushed right up until into this whole glenoid fossa, which is basically the capsule of the shoulder. Now, when we run out of space inside that environment, whenever we try to lift our arm overhead, this bone here basically catches onto many different structures, but one of them is a tendon that runs just underneath here. It's called your supraspinatus tendon. Runs just under the clavicle. So we get that pinching element every single time we lift our arm. Now, there's many reasons why you're getting that element, and it may have nothing to do with the shoulder. You have to look globally at all the structures surrounding the shoulder to understand the shoulder. It's not a case of just simply taking an external, like a rehab exercise, external rotation, or a movement with a stick to try and free up the joint. You've got to look at the entire structure in its global entirety. So you have to look at all the fundamental areas and neighboring body parts that will result in exactly what's occurring with that joint. So it is a complex joint. So we need to be very mindful as to how we manage it and what route we take. The lower back, a very common area of pain. The lower back pain can be induced by many different things. So let's discuss all those different elements that can occur. Now, right from the common ones, right up to the complex ones. You can have vertebral fractures along the actual vertebral column of the spine. That would generally be induced by someone that suffers from osteoporosis. You've also got spinal stenosis, which is a narrowing of the space around the spinal column, okay? And that effectively is a direct result of osteoarthritis. Now, those two conditions are very extensive, and it's not something you can just remedy. There's no medication to just take for it, so you really need to speak to the right professionals to make sure that you're looking after those areas. Now, scoliosis, now that's an abnormal curvature of the spine. Scoliosis doesn't necessarily mean we have a normal just S-bend. You've got to remember that the spine is almost like a snake, so it can S-bend and then it starts to turn and rotate at different segments. So if it's going to rotate this way, the upper section is going to rotate the other way. That creates a massive amount of pressure on all of these vertical columns of our spine. Obviously, it restricts our movement patterns. It restricts our daily function. It can cause a massive amount of discomfort, radiating throughout the entire system globally away from our spine as well. So remember, like I said earlier, your spine really is the center to all our movements. All our movements, including our core structures, work off our spinal column, and everything is driven off that right down to our extremities. So if we take into account herniated disc, which is something we most of us have heard of before, otherwise known as a slip disc, as you can see on this diagram, you've got a herniated disc here. So it's basically where you can have a tearing of a disc, and that's a different scenario, but a herniated disc is one that basically pushes out into the nerve canal. It can, doesn't always, but it can result in nerve impingement along that area. Okay, now as soon as you get that, you've got to remember, as our central nervous system indicated, all our nerve endings run there. You're going to have a ridiculous pain to some extremity of the body that's going to induce discomfort. So this is where typically when it comes to like an L4, L5, right near our lower back area, when we get that nerve impingement, often a very common issue is that sciatic pain, where you feel it under the glute, down the back of the leg. And then you've got that peroneal pain on the side of the leg. That can be very debilitating. People that have had that know what it's like. They wouldn't want to wish it on anyone. It's really painful. But take into account the herniated disc. It's essential. It's essential that you do not do movements that promote the compression of those joints in exercise. Now, there's a ton of gym-related exercises that will do just that. It will compress the vertebra. It'll squeeze the space down onto that disc space. It'll promote more herniation of that disc. It will reduce, not only that, it will also affect the vertebral bodies above and below that point as well. So you've got to remember, any weakness here is going to be closely chased by a weakness above and below that joint, which becomes concerning with regards to spinal longevity. So it's essential that we really start looking at the spine in its entirety. Do we want to strengthen our core? Absolutely. Yeah, well, that goes without saying. But now typically someone with a condition like where there's vertebral movements. In other words, this is a vertebra here of the spine. So when you get vertebral movement, there's a condition called retrolesthesis, okay, which is a posterior bulging of one of the vertebrae. And obviously then we've got your spondylolesthesis, which is the forward bulging of a vertebra. So the retrolesthesis is where this segment here basically pushes out behind this guy. All right, now what that does do, it places a lot of strain on the disc, absolutely. But what it does do, you must understand that when it comes to movements like rotation, and we're going to go and reach for our seatbelt, or we're going to turn, and we're going to pick up our child, we have bone structures that are not stacked correctly. And when they're not stacked correctly, you can get a massive amount of friction, and those bone endings can start pushing on nerves directly, causing a massive amount of pain and a huge amount of degeneration thereafter. So that's also something that we want to take into account. But when it comes to spinal health, at the end of the day, the spine, basically from a neurological perspective, is going to feed a lot of the motor control running right down our leg system, all the way right down to our feet. So it's important that we manage our spine, not necessarily at our spine. There's fundamentally a huge amount of areas that you have to bring together to make sure that you're managing the system in its entirety. It doesn't work in isolation. The hip joint is the simplest joint in our system. From an operable perspective, very high success rates are given to hip replacements nowadays, given the relatively simple biomechanics surrounding the joint of the hip, as opposed to the shoulder that we just spoke about. So you've got a condition called a vascular necrosis, which is one condition. If you do suffer from this, you'll definitely know that you do. It's a restriction of blood flow within the joint itself. A lot of the tissue surrounding the hip starts to die off, and that can result in dislocation and fractures, and that can occur simply whilst walking or getting up or under any movement. It doesn't have to be under load. You've also got your osteoarthritis and your rheumatoid arthritis, which can play a role in this joint, as with any other joint in our system, where it starts to break down the cartilage in the joint structure, creates a lot of friction and results in a lot of pain and swelling, and obviously a reduction in range of movement. You've got bursitis, as with the shoulder. A very, very common scenario is hip bursitis. And a lot of weight-bearing elements and loading on the hip is counterintuitive. So would we run? No, not at all. The weight-bearing element, you've got to remember, is also induced by sitting. So by sitting, you're also bearing weight on your hips. So it does restrict a lot of activities if you do have bursitis, and you need to speak to the right professionals to make sure that you're not overloading those areas. From an exercise perspective, degeneration, and like typically something like labral tears. Now, the labral area is the cartilage that forms around the top of the actual femur, the thigh bone, okay? And it forms on the inside of that acetabulum, that socket. And it's not a very big socket. So it's almost like a golf tee. So it's not a very big capsule. So the reason why we have this design is to allow our leg to move freely. So the back portion, you can't really see it on this diagram, is structured, and the front portion is quite shallow, the back portion is quite deep, which allows for our leg range to go right up to the front, and we get almost about 30 degrees of extension just behind us. So it allows for the movement, but it's that rotation inside that joint. Due to repetitive bad movements, okay, that could mean simply by the way we're squatting. We're going in the gym and we're exercising and we're squatting endlessly with our trainer because he says squats are good. Okay, that's great because it burns calories, it works your glutes. Are you working your glutes? Are your glutes firing during your system? Have you looked at your entire system from your toes right up towards the middle of your back to know whether you're squatting well or not? Now that's a whole different conversation altogether. But as you can see, that labral issue, that cartilage in that area can be easily broken down due to bad form and exercise and movement. So that's an area that effectively we want to limit. You've got tendonitis as well, which is inflammation of those tendons surrounding the hip as we can get in the shoulder, which could be hugely painful. So do we want to start loading those tendons with movements that are counterintuitive, that are pretty much going to be loading that muscle connecting to the tendon? Do we want to start creating more friction inside that area? Not at all. We need to start adapting our systems to the right movements, and from a corrective perspective, we need to start involving movements that allow for not only freedom of movement, but essentially stability surrounding that joint structure. So from a hip perspective, a lot of individuals would prescribe the fact that you need to start mobilizing that hip. You need to start moving it. You need to start internally, externally rotating the hip. And you'll see all these videos on social media. There's millions of them out there that start promoting those type of scenarios. What happens? What happens if you've got any form of tendonitis in that area? What happens if you've got bursitis? Is that a good idea? Definitely not. So these type of scenarios, you've got to take into account. If you've had a fracture to the hip at all, simply from a lot of some older people tend to fall, they'll fracture their hip. Now, if that is the case, we've got to be very mindful what movement we're applying to that area. And so again, the rehabilitative work done on this region, even though the joint structure is not overly complex, has to be sound with regards to the right direction, and more specifically, what targeted muscles are we working? What targeted areas are we relieving? And are we on any anti-inflammatories? Typically, a condition like a vascular necrosis is heightened by the sustained use of your cortisol steroid use as well. So that can really break down that joint, and it's most common with the hip joint as opposed to any other joint in our system. Okay, so the knee. We've all had some knee pain from time to time. It could be quite a common issue that results in it, something not very serious, and the pain goes away. In most cases, that's generally an alignment and structural based dysfunction. But there are many different conditions that actually can lead to some serious knee pain. One of which is osteoarthritis, which is obviously a degenerative disorder surrounding the joint, and if it does attack the knee, it's gruesome. It really is. The pain can be quite extensive. It can come and go depending on your activity, but normally associated with that condition is that ring type of pain associated around that whole joint. You've got bursitis discomfort as well, which is that bursa, like we have in other joints. We've got two fluid-filled sacs on either side of the knee, which basically allow the tendons and ligaments to glide freely over that area. And if those areas are compromised, you're going to have located pain on the side of the knees as well. You've got your patellofemoral syndrome. Now, that is generally a syndrome that's normally associated with pain, generally speaking, behind the knee, and common activities like squatting, cycling, and stairs would contribute quite a lot to that discomfort surrounding that joint. Now, You've got tendonitis as well, which is a big one. Now, typically talking about tendonitis, it's the most common one that we generally have from day to day, but it can be from overloading. So it may be repetitive activities or overloading of one activity more so. So if we talk about the tendons, there are a few, but let's chat about the patella tendon specifically. That's a tendon that sits just above the kneecap here, and it attaches to one of the thigh muscles, okay? That muscle is called your rectus femoris. Now, that muscle attaches up to the hip. So if we have had any form of surgical procedure done on that patella, do we want to start loading that structure with squats? No. Do we eventually want to start loading it with squats? Yes. But there needs to be a very scaled up process by the time you get there. So you need to make sure that you're dealing with the correct specialist, the correct individual, to make sure that you're building up what is known as tendon resiliency. So if you're not building up that tendon resiliency within the knee, and more specifically that patella tendon, that muscle's never going to be ready to be loaded, because you're going to compromise that patella immediately, and you don't want to end back up in surgery again. So that is hugely important to understand. You've got the meniscus. Okay, now the meniscus is almost it's a circular shaped, almost a C-shaped cartilage. It forms under the kneecap. It's almost like a shock absorber, and that area can basically degenerate and with a bit of wear and tear. Again, depending on the activity that you do, and there's a certain area of the meniscus that's not operable, that you don't need an operation on because it gets an amount of blood supply. And there's another area of the meniscus that unfortunately there's not enough blood supply. And in most cases, if there's fragments floating around the joint, you'll need an arthroscopy to go in there to clear it out, and immediately you'll find the discomfort will reduce quite extensively. Nowadays, keyhole surgery is absolutely phenomenal, but like anything else, you only want to do it if you need it. Okay, so you've got to address all the different areas. You've also got a condition like RTB, which is your RT band. Now, the RT band basically sits right along the outside of the leg. Okay, so you won't see it here. This is the inside, but on the outside of the leg, it attaches from the hip right down to the side of the knee. Very, very common runner's injury. And unfortunately, that in most cases is without a doubt a structural related issue and an imbalance issue. And from a correctional perspective, well, that is, I won't say it's easy to remedy because there's many role players that result in RTB, and it doesn't have to even be on that leg. It can be coming from somewhere totally different in our system. But it is a scenario that does result in quite a bit of pain on the outside of the knee. And it's very debilitating. You find you're running for a period of time, you start to get that pain, and that's it. Your body shuts down. It's not prepared to continue weight-bearing load on that side. It doesn't want it. And then if we do start to endure that activity and we work through it, no pain, no gain, all that nonsense, what happens, we start overloading the other leg. Then we start getting a bit of back discomfort, possibly a bit of knee, maybe a little bit of piriformis discomfort, which is a pain deep inside the glutes. You start getting all sorts of areas, start complaining on the other side because we're not addressing an issue on one side. So that's obviously that's a scenario where you have to have someone like myself, for example, to be able to assess what is going on with your system from a holistic perspective and from a movement pattern point of view. Now, the actual meniscus, the RTB, all of those areas, they play a major role in discomfort. Included with that is an element called a Baker's cyst. Now, a Baker's cyst is it's like a hard lump basically behind the knee. Now, it's made up of synovial fluid. Now, synovial fluid lines our tendons and allows our tendons to move freely, sliding and gliding. Now, when we run out of synovial fluid, then those tendons specifically start to create a lot of friction when we move. Whatever we're doing, we start to get a lot of friction at those muscular tendinous junctions where the muscle joins onto the tendon. It can start becoming hugely painful. So again, when we have those type of areas, we've got to be very careful with what rehab exercises that we do. So do we want to start just going into a wall, sitting and squatting against a wall? Not at all. We want to do it when it's appropriate. With regards to like a Baker's cyst, for example, do we want to start lying on our back and start elevating our pelvis up, starting focusing on glute bridges that will undoubtedly possibly result in hamstring compensation? Because if your hamstrings are compensating for your glute muscles, that's going to influence that Baker's cyst again. So again, do we want to do that movement? No. You want to make sure that the movements you're doing are physiologically appropriate for you with regards to our entire system. The shoulder complex, as we know we've discussed, is quite extensive. If it's the neck, if it's posturally related, there's many, many different scenarios that can result in your discomfort and your journey through recovery, that is. So, folks, I hope you found this information somewhat informative. If you have any other questions and you'd like to contact us at Profit, feel free to email us at info@pro.fitgym.co.za. Don't forget the hyphen in between. It's not profit. The road to recovery can be, like I said at the beginning, quite extensive. Ask the right questions, get in touch with the right people, deal with the right professionals, make sure people are working together as a team to make sure that your recovery process is going to be a successful one. I hope you enjoyed this. We'll see you soon. Take care.